If we go back a step, there was also a very important development. That's a printing press that
Yeah, yeah,
set the stage for those developments.
sure.
And it was a great experiment because the Islamic world and the Christian world handled culturally the advent of the printing press in a totally different way. And I guess you have a whole nother book on those developments,
Yeah.
but it's worth diving into that too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can talk about the main thesis in my first book that came out in 2017. And what that book is looking at is mainly the economic divergence between Western Europe and the Middle East. And it really focuses on political legitimacy. So that book, unlike the book that we're talking about here, How the World Became Rich, that book puts forth my own thesis rather than kind of collecting other theses and trying to bring them together in a coherent story. And that thesis, focuses on political legitimacy. So this idea that how rulers stay in power might matter, and the reason it might matter is because there are people that help them stay in power, and those people get goodies for doing that. Now, in both Western Europe and the Middle East, religious authorities had historically played an incredibly important role in maintaining power, and thus they got things in return. They legitimated rules. So, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And one thing, one of the big things they got in return were policies that favored themselves, whether that be tax exemptions, suppressions of rival religions, or other policies like the one we'll talk about here. So by the 15th century, even prior to the Reformation, religious legitimacy had weakened in Europe. And as economic power became greater, as parliaments became more important across the continent. So even if the church had wanted to suppress the printing press, it really wasn't in a position to do so, because in order to suppress something like the printing press, you have to have the backing of secular authority, because the church itself doesn't have coercive power. It takes something like the threat of coercive power, the threat to punish or kill or jail or something like that to suppress a technology. So the press, it's invented around 1450 by Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany. It spreads rather rapidly in its first 50 years. So by 1500, most big cities in Europe have a printing press. Now, what was happening in the Ottoman Empire? We know that in the Ottoman Empire by 1485, three or some odd decades after Gutenberg's has his press, the Ottomans know about the press. And there's evidence that beginning in 1485, they prohibit any type of printing in the Arabic script. And this prohibition, we have reason to believe, lasts until 1727, when it's lifted for one printer, a Hungarian printer who's living in the Ottoman Empire, who wants to print some manuals, and they relieve it. But really, there's not really any printing until the early 19th century. Now, the question is why? And one thing, going back to this idea of religious legitimacy, is that the biggest losers from printing, potential losers, and almost certainly they would have been the biggest losers, would have been the religious establishment.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Truflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Truflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at truflation.com.
The religious establishment had a monopoly over intellectual transmission, over the interpretation of the Quran and other religious texts. And this is something that would have almost certainly opened up to a much broader swath of the population. And this was the very thing that gave them power in the first place. So they had a huge incentive, if they could, to prevent the press. Now, a big difference between the Middle East and Western Europe is that religious authorities in the Middle East, Islamic clerics, still had a lot of political power. So they had the Sultan's backing, and it was in the Sultan's interest then to not undermine one of their major supporters. So that's the idea. And there's huge implications from this. So one that eventually comes down the road, though not immediately, is literacy, of course. It takes a while, But by 1700 or so, there's reason to believe that at least in northwestern Europe, the Dutch Republic and England, that literacy rates were at least above 50%. So by that period, even prior to industrialization, most of the non-agricultural class, let's say, people living in cities would have probably been able to read. And this does have massive implications down the road because, even though the Industrial Revolution is not the first Industrial Revolution, I should say, the one that goes from about, circa 1750 to 1830, even though that one is not mainly science-based. There are a few things that are science-based, like the steam engine uses scientific principles, but more or less the rest, most of it's machines. The machines that are kind of learning by doing. You see how something's done, you make some adjustments or you make some advancements on how it's done. But still, stuff like knowing how to read is really important for being able to, write manuals, to spread information about how machines work, even for workers to be able to give information to workers on how to work these machines, how to repair the machines. This is part of the overall process. Also say, one of the biggest, I did argue in my book, and I think, and I'm very much not unique in this opinion, that maybe the biggest consequence of the spread of printing in Europe was that it directly facilitated the Protestant Reformation, which was not just a religious movement, but it was a social and even political movement as well. It really, where the Reformation took hold, it really changed the politics of those places, and it really changed the politics in such a way where secular power the power of the economic elite became much stronger, which, I should say it's not like I would be advocating for economic elites to fully run a country by any means, but having them almost completely out of power, which was the case for the large part, at least, urban economic elites prior to the Reformation, most of these places, and certainly was the case in, the leading Islamic empires, something like the Ottoman Empire. That's really not good for economic growth.
And they had a real live example of what they should be worried about in Islamic territories, watching Reformation create this massive, monstrous movement that wound up being very violent. They were right to be worried about their power base.
Definitely. Yeah.
Hey, if you like this clip, please hit the subscribe button. You might also want to check out some of the clips I've posted with my many other guests. My interviews all address the simple question, how screwed are we? We ask experts about the problems that make Americans so pessimistic today, but we also explore why there's never been a better time to have been born than today. Join us for perspective on today's challenges and opportunities.